It was a chilly autumn afternoon in Central Park, New York. The golden leaves danced in the wind as Molly Parker skipped along the pathway, humming a tune that her mother, Alice, often sang to her. She held a brown paper bag with a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, the crust carefully cut off, just the way she liked it. As she reached a quiet bench under a large oak tree, she noticed a man sitting there, his clothes worn and disheveled. He looked up, startled by her presence. His face, lined with age and hardship, softened as he made brief eye contact. He had the look of someone who had once known better days. Molly, being a curious and kind-hearted 8-year-old, stopped in her tracks and tilted her head. "Hi," she said, her voice gentle but filled with the innocence of childhood. The man hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure she was talking to him. "Hi," he replied, his voice raspy, probably from days, maybe weeks, of not speaking much. Molly stepped closer, her eyes wide with a mixture of concern and curiosity. She looked down at her sandwich and then back at him. "Are you hungry?" He didn't answer at first, but his eyes betrayed the answer. Molly noticed the way his gaze lingered on the bag in her hand. Without another word, she held out the sandwich. "You can have it if you want," she offered, her hand steady, though her small fingers barely wrapped around the bag. The man blinked, taken aback by the gesture. His weathered hands slowly reached out, trembling as they grasped the sandwich. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with a mix of gratitude and sadness. His eyes met hers again, but this time, they seemed to hold back something. Pain, regret, or perhaps memories long buried. "What's your name?" Molly asked, sitting on the bench beside him, her feet dangling off the edge. He swallowed hard, unwrapping the sandwich slowly, as if savoring the moment. "Walter," he replied after a long pause. "Walter Hughes." She smiled brightly. "I'm Molly. My mom says we should always help people when we can." Walter's expression softened even more as he took a careful bite of the sandwich. It had been days since he'd had anything substantial to eat. "Your mom's a smart woman?" he said between bites, his voice barely audible. Molly beamed with pride, swinging her legs back and forth. "She is. She's always busy, though. She works a lot, but we still have time to come to the park on weekends." Walter nodded, listening to her talk about her life, her school, her friends, her mom, while he finished the sandwich. For the first time in years, he felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't known he missed. The simple kindness of this little girl touched him in ways he couldn't explain. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the park, Molly stood up. "I have to go now. My mom will be looking for me." She glanced back at Walter. "Will you be here again?" Walter hesitated, unsure of what to say. "Maybe," he replied, his voice distant, as if lost in thought. "Maybe I will." With a final wave, Molly skipped off, disappearing down the path, leaving Walter alone on the bench once again. He looked down at the empty paper bag in his hands, a lump forming in his throat. The sandwich had been simple, but the gesture, it was something else. It stirred something deep inside him, something he thought had died long ago. As he sat there, staring at the empty bag, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just met someone incredibly important. The following morning, Molly's house in the Upper West Side was quiet, filled with the usual warmth of home. Alice Parker, Molly's mother, sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee, her mind already occupied with the tasks of the day. She glanced out the window, watching Molly in the living room, coloring in one of her many books. It was an ordinary Saturday, until the sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the stillness. Alice frowned, glancing up at the clock. She wasn't expecting anyone. From the kitchen window, she saw a sleek, black luxury car pull up in front of their townhouse. The door opened, and a well-dressed man in a tailored suit stepped out. His polished appearance seemed out of place in their quiet neighborhood. He straightened his tie, his face serious as he approached the house. Alice's heart quickened. She wasn't sure why, but a chill ran down her spine. She got up quickly, walking to the front door just as the doorbell rang. "Molly, stay here," she instructed, her voice firmer than usual. Molly barely looked up from her drawings, her focus still on her crayons. Alice opened the door cautiously, peeking through the crack before pulling it open all the way. The man smiled politely, but there was something about him, something official and cold. "Mrs. Parker?" he asked, his voice smooth, almost practiced. "Yes, that's me," Alice replied, her heart racing, unsure of where this was going. "Can I help you?" The man nodded and reached into his briefcase, pulling out a thick folder. "I'm John Spencer, an attorney representing Walter Hughes," he said calmly, his eyes studying her reaction closely. The name struck her like a blow to the chest. Alice's expression faltered, her face draining of color. She took a step back, gripping the edge of the doorframe. "Walter Hughes," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. John nodded again, his face softening slightly as he realized the weight of the moment. "I'm afraid this might come as a shock, but Mr. Hughes has recently come forward with information. He is Molly's biological father." The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded in the quiet of their home. Alice stared at the man in disbelief, her mind racing, scrambling to make sense of what she had just heard. "Walter Hughes? Here? That's impossible," Alice finally said, her voice trembling. He's. She struggled to find the right words, her thoughts spinning. "I understand how difficult this must be, Mrs. Parker," the lawyer said, his voice still steady, but there was a hint of sympathy in his tone. "Walter has been homeless for some time now, after losing his business and everything he owned. But he's been trying to rebuild his life, and one of his priorities was finding his daughter." Alice's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted toward the living room where Molly was still peacefully coloring, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing at the front door. She quickly stepped outside, closing the door behind her so that Molly wouldn't overhear. "You're telling me that Walter Hughes, a man who's been absent for years, now wants to come back into my daughter's life?" Alice hissed, her anger bubbling up, overtaking the shock. John remained calm, unfazed by her reaction. "I understand your concerns, and I'm not here to pressure you into anything. Walter simply wants a chance, just a conversation to explain his side of the story." Alice's hands trembled as she crossed her arms defensively. Memories of her past with Walter flooded her mind. The love they once shared before everything fell apart, before he disappeared. She had made a life for Molly without him, had kept the truth hidden to protect her from the pain of abandonment. And now, he was back? Why now? Alice asked, her voice strained. Why after all these years? The lawyer paused for a moment before answering. He's not the man he used to be. Life has been unkind to him, and he's paid the price for his mistakes. But he never stopped thinking about Molly. He just didn't have the means. Until now. Alice took a deep breath, trying to regain control over the swirling emotions inside her. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice softer now, tinged with something between curiosity and fear. "He's close by, in the city," John said, handing her a business card with Walter's information. "He asked me to approach you first." He didn't want to just show up unannounced. Alice stared at the card in her hand, her thumb running over the embossed name. It felt surreal. Walter Hughes. "I need time," Alice said finally, her voice barely audible. "This is a lot to process." "Of course," John nodded, understanding. "Take all the time you need. Walter just wanted to make sure you knew the truth." Alice glanced back at the house, at her daughter, who still had no idea her entire world was about to change. The weight of the decision pressed down on her like a boulder. She had kept this secret for so long, and now it was unraveling before her eyes. Could she really let Walter back into their lives? What would that mean for Molly? For her? As John turned to leave, Alice stood frozen in the doorway, staring down at the card in her hand, her heart pounding in her chest. That evening, Alice sat on the edge of her bed, staring blankly at the phone in her hand. John Spencer's business card rested on the nightstand, the name Walter Hughes staring back at her like a ghost from her past. The weight of the revelation pressed down on her, threatening to suffocate her. How could she explain this to Molly? How could she tell her that the man she met in the park wasn't just a stranger? He was her father. The sound of Molly's laughter echoed from the living room, where she was watching her favorite show. The innocent sound brought tears to Alice's eyes. She had built a safe, stable life for Molly, far away from the chaos and uncertainty that had once defined her relationship with Walter. And now, in the space of a single afternoon, that fragile sense of security was teetering on the edge of collapse. Unable to sit still, Alice stood up and began pacing the room, her thoughts swirling. She had to talk to someone, to say the words out loud. Without thinking, she dialed her sister, Jessica. The phone rang twice before Jessica's familiar, comforting voice answered. "Alice? What's going on? You sound stressed." Alice swallowed hard, trying to gather her thoughts. "Jess, it's about Walter. He's back." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Jessica responded. "Walter? That Walter? Molly's father?" "Yeah," Alice whispered, her voice trembling. "He found us, Jess. He wants to see Molly." Jessica's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. "Alice, are you serious? After all these years? Why now? How did this even happen?" Alice explained everything. The lawyer, the car, the revelation that Walter had been living on the streets, and the innocent encounter Molly had with him in the park. By the time she finished, her voice was thick with emotion, and she felt drained, like all the energy had been sucked out of her. "I don't know what to do," Alice admitted, her voice breaking. "I've kept this secret from Molly her whole life. How do I tell her now? How do I explain why I hid this from her?" Jessica was quiet for a moment, processing everything Alice had said. "You were trying to protect her," she finally said. "Walter put you through hell back then, Alice. You had every right to keep her safe." Alice sighed, sinking back onto the bed. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but what if I've been wrong all these years? What if keeping him away was a mistake?" Jessica's voice softened. "You did what you had to do. You didn't know where he was, if he was coming back. You couldn't wait around forever." "I know," Alice whispered, wiping away a tear. "But now he's here, and I don't know if I can keep him away anymore. Molly has a right to know." There was another long silence before Jessica spoke again, her tone firm but compassionate. "You're going to have to tell her, Alice. Sooner or later, she's going to ask questions. You can't keep this a secret anymore. But take your time. Don't rush into anything." Alice nodded, though Jessica couldn't see her. She knew her sister was right, but the thought of sitting Molly down and explaining everything made her feel sick. How could she tell her sweet, innocent daughter that her real father was a broken man, a stranger they had passed in the park? "Thanks, Jess," Alice murmured. "I just needed to hear someone say it." "You can always call me," Jessica replied softly. "Whatever happens, I'm here for you." After they hung up, Alice sat in silence, the weight of the decision still heavy on her chest. She had no idea how to begin that conversation with Molly, but she knew she couldn't hide from it much longer. It was only a matter of time before Molly started asking questions Alice had dreaded for years. Later that night, as Alice tucked Molly into bed, her daughter's big, innocent eyes looked up at her with pure love and trust. Alice felt her heart clench. Molly had no idea how much her world was about to change. "Mommy, why do you look sad?" Molly asked, her small hand reaching up to touch Alice's cheek. Alice forced a smile, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "I'm not sad, sweetie. I'm just tired." Molly smiled, satisfied with the answer. "Okay, can we go to the park again tomorrow? Maybe I'll see my friend there." Alice froze. "Your friend?" she asked, her voice tight. "Yeah, the man I gave my sandwich to." Molly's eyes sparkled with pride. "He was nice, Mommy. He said his name was Walter." Alice's stomach twisted into knots. She couldn't hold back the truth much longer, but tonight wasn't the night. She wasn't ready. "We'll see," Alice said softly, brushing Molly's hair out of her face. "Now get some sleep, okay? Sweet dreams." Molly nodded and snuggled into her blankets, her eyes fluttering closed. Alice stayed there, watching her daughter sleep, wondering how she would ever find the right words to shatter her little girl's perfect world. As Alice stood to leave the room, she glanced back at Molly one last time. The weight of her past was heavy on her shoulders, and she knew that in the days to come, there would be no avoiding the truth. Walter Hughes wasn't just a ghost from her past anymore. He was very real, and Alice had no choice but to face him and everything he represented. The next morning, Alice woke early, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the curtains of her bedroom. She hadn't slept much. Her mind had been consumed with thoughts of Walter and the enormous decision that lay ahead. She couldn't keep the truth from Molly any longer, but the thought of facing Walter again after so many years filled her with a mixture of dread and uncertainty. As she sipped her coffee at the kitchen table, Alice heard Molly's light footsteps padding down the hallway. The little girl appeared in the doorway, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. "Morning, Mommy," Molly chirped, her innocent smile brightening the room. Alice forced a smile in return, though her heart was heavy. "Good morning, sweetheart. How about some pancakes for breakfast?" Molly's eyes lit up at the mention of pancakes, and for a brief moment, everything felt normal. But as Alice moved around the kitchen, flipping pancakes, the weight of her secret pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. The calm was shattered by the sudden ring of the doorbell. Alice froze, her heart skipping a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. Molly looked up from her seat at the table, curious. "Stay here, Molly," Alice instructed, her voice firmer than usual. Alice wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked slowly to the door, her pulse quickening with each step. When she opened it, her worst fears were confirmed. Walter stood there on the porch. He looked different, older, more worn down by the years, but there was no mistaking him. His face, though weathered and tired, still held that familiar look in his eyes. It was the same man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. But now, the life he had led since then seemed etched into every line on his face. "Hello, Alice," he said, his voice soft but strained. His gaze lingered on her, as if trying to read her reaction. Alice gripped the edge of the door, her knuckles white. She hadn't been prepared to face him like this, not after everything. She swallowed hard, trying to control the flood of emotions rising inside her. "Walter," she said, barely managing to get the word out. "What are you doing here?" Walter shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting nervously at his sides. "I know I shouldn't have come, but I couldn't wait any longer. I needed to see you, and Molly." At the mention of Molly's name, Alice's protective instincts flared up. She tightened her grip on the door. "She doesn't know yet," Alice said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I haven't told her." Walter winced but nodded slowly, as if he had expected this. "I understand," he said quietly. "I don't want to force anything. I want to be a part of her life again, Alice. I've made so many mistakes, but Molly, she's my daughter, and I need a chance to make things right." Alice felt her throat tighten as anger and pain bubbled to the surface. She stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind her to keep Molly from hearing. "You had years to be a part of her life, Walter. Years," she hissed, her eyes flashing with anger. "You left. You disappeared without a word, and I had to pick up the pieces. I had to raise her on my own. Now you just show up and expect to be forgiven?" Walter's eyes filled with regret, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of her words was too much to bear. "I never wanted to leave, Alice," he said, his voice breaking. "You know that. But after everything fell apart, after I lost the business, the money, everything, I couldn't face you. I couldn't face what I had become." Alice's heart pounded in her chest as old memories flooded back. She remembered the nights they would stay up late, dreaming of a bright future together, the promises Walter had made to take care of their family. But those dreams had crumbled under the weight of his failures, and when he had lost everything, he had walked away, leaving her to deal with the fallout. "You should have come to me," Alice said, her voice trembling with hurt. "I could have helped you. We could have figured it out together. But you didn't even give me the chance." Walter ran a hand through his graying hair, his eyes filled with sorrow. I know I failed you, Alice. I failed both of you. But I'm here now, and I'm trying to make amends." Alice crossed her arms tightly over her chest, feeling the chill of the morning air. She wasn't ready to forgive him. Not yet. But the truth was, part of her understood his pain. The man standing in front of her wasn't the same person who had left all those years ago. Life had broken him in ways she hadn't seen until now. Walter hesitated, glancing down at the ground before looking back up at Alice. "I want to rebuild, Alice. Not just for me, But for Molly, I've missed so much of her life, and I don't want to miss any more. Please, just give me a chance. Alice clenched her jaw, torn between her anger and the faint glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, Walter could redeem himself. But she couldn't make this decision alone. Molly had to be a part of it. I don't know if I can trust you again, Alice said, her voice low but firm. But Molly deserves to know the truth. I won't lie to her anymore. Walter nodded, a small flicker of hope in his eyes. That's all I ask. I just want the chance to prove I can be there for her. Alice didn't respond right away. She took a deep breath and turned to glance at the window, where Molly sat, blissfully unaware of the conversation happening just outside. It was time for the truth to come out, no matter how painful it would be. Give me some time, Alice said finally, her voice heavy with the weight of the decision. I need to figure out how to tell her. Walter's expression softened, and he gave a slow, grateful nod. Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready. With that, he turned and walked down the steps of the porch, disappearing into the city streets. Alice stood there for a moment, watching him go, her heart pounding. This was the beginning of something she had tried so hard to avoid. The past was back, and now she had to face it head-on. For Molly's sake. Alice turned and went back inside, closing the door behind her. She leaned against it for a moment, gathering her thoughts, before walking over to the kitchen where Molly was waiting, her little face full of innocent curiosity. Mommy, who was that? Molly asked, her eyes wide. Alice sat down beside her, reaching for her hand. Molly, sweetie, there's something I need to tell you. The house felt unnervingly quiet that evening, even as the sound of Molly's soft voice drifted from the living room, where she played with her dolls. Alice stood in the kitchen, staring blankly at the plate of untouched food in front of her. Her hands rested on the table, but her fingers trembled slightly, the weight of what she had to do pressing down on her like a mountain. She had spent the entire day trying to think of how to tell Molly the truth. Every time Alice thought she had the words, her chest tightened and her thoughts scattered. She hadn't expected Walter to show up so soon. She had been preparing to deal with this in her own time, but now the decision had been forced upon her. The truth could no longer be hidden, and Molly was about to find out everything. With a deep, shaky breath, Alice left the kitchen and moved toward the living room. Her heart pounded in her chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. She could see Molly sitting cross-legged on the floor, her dolls spread out in front of her. The little girl looked up and beamed at her mother, completely unaware of the life-altering conversation that was about to take place. Mommy, do you want to play with me? Molly asked, holding up one of her dolls and smiling brightly. Alice's heart clenched. How was she supposed to break her daughter's world apart with news like this? For a moment, Alice wanted to sit down on the floor with Molly and pretend that nothing was wrong. She wanted to cling to this moment of innocence just a little longer. But she knew she couldn't. Molly, sweetheart, Alice began, her voice soft but tinged with tension. We need to talk for a minute, okay? Molly blinked, confused by the change in her mother's tone. She slowly set her doll down and scooted closer to Alice, her wide eyes filled with curiosity. What's wrong, Mommy? Alice knelt beside her, reaching out to gently pull her daughter into her lap. Molly's small body felt so fragile in her arms, and Alice could feel her pulse quicken, her mind racing as she struggled to find the right words. Molly, Alice began again, her voice tight as she tried to keep it steady. Do you remember the man you met in the park the other day? The one you gave your sandwich to? Molly's face lit up with recognition. Walter. Yeah, I remember him. He was nice, Mommy. Is he okay? Is that what you wanted to talk about? Alice swallowed hard. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind, but now that it was here, it felt so much harder. She could see the light in Molly's eyes, the warmth of childhood innocence, and she knew that what she was about to say would change everything. Yes, sweetheart, it's about Walter, Alice said, her voice shaking just slightly. He's not just someone you met in the park. Molly tilted her head, the confusion deepening in her expression. What do you mean? Who is he, Mommy? Alice took a deep breath, steadying herself. She couldn't avoid it any longer. Molly, she said, her voice tender but heavy with the weight of the truth. Walter is your real father." The room fell into a profound silence. Molly blinked, her brow furrowing in confusion as she tried to process what her mother had just said. She looked at Alice, her small face scrunched up as if trying to make sense of a puzzle with too many missing pieces. "My real father?" Molly echoed, her voice soft, almost unsure. "But I thought Daddy was gone. You said." Alice's heart twisted painfully. She had always told Molly that her father wasn't in the picture, that he had left before she was born. It was true, but only in part. Walter had been gone, but not in the way Molly had imagined. "I know, sweetheart," Alice whispered, her hand brushing a strand of hair away from Molly's face. "I know I told you that, and it's true. Walter wasn't able to be here for you when you were little, but he didn't stop caring about you." Molly's face softened, but confusion still lingered in her wide eyes. "Why didn't he come back? Where did he go?" Alice's chest tightened as the memories of the past surged forward, memories she had worked so hard to bury. She hadn't expected Molly's innocent questions to cut so deep. "Walter went through some very hard times, Molly," she explained gently. "He lost his home, his job, everything. He felt like he couldn't take care of us, so he left." Molly sat quietly, absorbing her mother's words. Her fingers absent-mindedly played with the hem of her shirt, twisting it nervously as her young mind tried to make sense of the story. "He didn't want to stay?" Alice felt tears sting her eyes. She had never wanted Molly to feel abandoned, but now it seemed inevitable. "He wanted to, sweetie," Alice said, her voice thick with emotion. "But he thought he was doing the right thing by leaving. He thought it would be better for us." Molly's eyes, wide with uncertainty, searched Alice's face. "Did he stop loving us?" The question hit Alice like a punch to the gut. She shook her head quickly, pulling Molly close. "No, Molly. He never stopped loving you. He didn't know how to come back." Molly was quiet for a long moment, her little hands resting on her mother's lap. "Is he still like that? Does he still have no home?" Alice's heart ached. The innocence of Molly's questions was almost too much to bear. "He's trying to get back on his feet," Alice explained softly. "He's not the same as he was before. He's been through a lot, but he wants to be a part of your life now." Molly looked down at her hands, her brow furrowed in thought. She seemed to be processing everything slowly, carefully. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she looked back up at Alice. "Does he want to see me?" Alice nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, he does. But only if you want to see him, too. It's your choice." Molly's face softened, and she nodded quietly, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. "I want to see him," she said after a moment, her voice steady but soft. "I want to know him." Alice felt a strange mix of relief and sadness wash over her. Molly had taken the news better than she had expected, but the gravity of the situation still weighed heavily on her. Her daughter's world was about to change forever, and nothing would be the same after this. "Okay, Molly," Alice whispered, brushing a kiss to her daughter's forehead. "We'll make it happen." Molly smiled faintly, then pulled herself away from Alice's lap and returned to her dolls, as if retreating back into her world of play to process everything that had just happened. Alice watched her for a long time, her heart heavy with the burden of the past and the uncertainty of the future. She knew that she had done the right thing by telling Molly the truth, but it didn't make the next steps any easier. There were still so many unanswered questions, so much unresolved pain between her and Walter. And now, they would have to face it together. Later that night, as Alice lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, she felt her phone buzz on the nightstand. It was a message from Walter. "Thank you for telling her. I know how hard this must have been for you. I'll wait as long as it takes to see her. Just let me know when you think it's right." Alice stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the keys. She could feel the weight of Walter's words, his plea for redemption, for a second chance. She hadn't seen or heard from him in so long, and now here he was, back in their lives, asking to be let in again. Not just for Molly's sake, but for his own. Her fingers trembled as she typed her reply. "She wants to see you. I'll let you know when it's time." For a long while after that, Alice lay in the darkness, her mind racing with thoughts of the past and what the future might hold. Could she really trust Walter again? Could she allow him back into their lives after everything they had been through? Molly was ready to meet him, but Alice wasn't sure if her own heart could withstand the wounds reopening. One thing was certain. The delicate balance of their lives had shifted. Walter was back, and nothing would ever be the same. The day came sooner than Alice had anticipated. As she drove towards Central Park, Molly sat quietly in the back seat, her eyes fixed on the passing cityscape. Normally, she would be chattering about everything she saw, excitedly pointing out the stores, people, and landmarks. But today, the car was filled with an almost palpable silence. Molly's mind was elsewhere, and Alice knew exactly why. "Are you okay, sweetie?" Alice asked gently, glancing at her daughter in the rearview mirror. Molly shifted in her seat and nodded slowly. "Yeah, just thinking." Alice wanted to ask what was on her mind, but she didn't want to push too hard. Molly had been surprisingly calm since learning the truth about Walter, but Alice could feel the uncertainty bubbling just beneath the surface, even if her daughter hadn't expressed it yet. As they pulled into the parking lot, Alice's heart began to race. She parked the car and turned to Molly, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "We can take this one step at a time, okay? If you feel uncomfortable, we'll leave. There's no pressure." Molly nodded again, a small smile playing on her lips. "I want to see him, Mommy." Alice's chest tightened with emotion, but she nodded, forcing a reassuring smile. "All right, let's go then." They stepped out of the car and made their way into Central Park, where the familiar sounds of the city faded into the background, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant chatter of other park visitors. Alice walked beside Molly, who clutched her mother's hand tightly, her small fingers squeezing nervously. The sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground as they followed the winding path toward the bench where Walter had agreed to meet them. Alice's heart raced as they neared the spot, a sense of dread and anticipation building with each step. And then, there he was. Walter sat on the same bench where Molly had first offered him the sandwich, his head bowed slightly, his hands clasped together in his lap. He wore a clean shirt, and his hair, though streaked with gray, was neatly combed back. He looked better than the last time Alice had seen him, but the years of hardship were still evident in the lines on his face and the weariness in his posture. As they approached, Walter looked up, his eyes immediately locking onto Molly. His expression softened, and for a moment, he looked utterly vulnerable. Like a man seeing something precious he thought he had lost forever. Molly hesitated, glancing up at Alice for reassurance. Alice knelt down beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, sweetie," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything if you don't want to." Molly took a deep breath and nodded. With that small gesture, she let go of Alice's hand and took a tentative step forward, her eyes never leaving Walter's. Walter stood up slowly, as if he didn't want to startle her. He smiled gently, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Hi, Molly," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "It's really good to see you again." Molly didn't say anything at first, her wide eyes studying him carefully. She seemed to be searching for something, some sign, some feeling that would confirm who this man really was to her. "Hi," she finally whispered, her voice small but steady. There was a long, tense pause, as if time had slowed for both of them. Alice stood just a few steps behind, watching the exchange with bated breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what to expect from this moment, no way of knowing how it would play out. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for you before," Walter continued, his voice breaking slightly. He knelt down so he was at eye level with Molly, keeping his distance but still close enough for her to feel his presence. "I know I missed a lot of your life, and that's my fault, but I've always thought about you, every single day." Molly's eyes shimmered with uncertainty, but there was no anger there, just curiosity and maybe a flicker of hope. "Why didn't you come back?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Walter's face crumpled slightly at the question, as though the weight of it had struck him deeply. I wasn't ready," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I wasn't the kind of father you deserved. I was scared, And I didn't want to make things worse for you and your mom. But I was wrong, Molly. I should have been there. Molly looked down at her shoes, kicking a small pebble with the tip of her sneaker. Mommy says you had hard times. Walter nodded, his throat tight as he struggled to hold back his emotions. Yes, I did. But that's no excuse for leaving you. I want to try and make things right, if you'll let me. For a long moment, Molly didn't say anything. Alice could see the gears turning in her daughter's mind. Her small face a mixture of confusion, sadness, and something like cautious hope. Finally, Molly took a step closer, her voice quiet but firm. I gave you my sandwich because you looked sad, she said, her gaze meeting his. I didn't know you were my dad. Walter smiled, a tear slipping down his cheek. That sandwich meant more to me than you'll ever know. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for me in a long time. Molly seemed to think about that for a moment, then asked, Do you like peanut butter and jelly? Walter chuckled softly, wiping the tear from his face. I love it. It's one of my favorites. Molly smiled shyly, and for the first time, Alice could see the walls between them begin to soften. The moment was fragile, delicate, like a tiny sprout pushing its way through the cracks of a broken foundation. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was the beginning of something. Alice stepped forward then, her heart swelling with emotion as she watched the two of them connect in the smallest but most significant way. Molly, how about we sit down together? She suggested, her voice gentle. Molly nodded, and the three of them sat on the bench, Walter on one end, Alice on the other, and Molly between them. For a while, they sat in silence, the sounds of the park around them, a distant dog barking, the murmur of people walking by, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The quiet wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was filled with a strange sense of calm. After a few minutes, Molly spoke again, her voice soft but full of curiosity. What was I like when I was a baby? She asked, glancing between Walter and Alice. Walter looked at Alice, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. He smiled, his eyes bright with the memory of the little girl he had missed so much. You were the most beautiful baby I'd ever seen, he said, his voice warm. You had the sweetest smile, even when you were just a few days old. I used to hold you for hours, just watching you sleep. Molly's eyes widened, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Did I cry a lot? Walter laughed gently. Oh, you did, especially at night. But even when you cried, I was just happy to be with you. Molly giggled, and Alice felt a lump rise in her throat. It was the first time she had seen them share something, a memory, a connection, and it filled her with a bittersweet mix of joy and sadness. As the afternoon sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting a golden light over the park, Alice realized something. This wasn't going to be easy. There would be more difficult conversations, more moments of uncertainty, and perhaps even more pain. But sitting there on that bench, watching Molly and Walter laugh together, she felt the smallest flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to heal the broken pieces of their lives. A few weeks passed after Molly's reunion with Walter, and the once uneasy silence between them began to fill with small moments of connection. They met in Central Park every weekend, sharing stories, laughter, and slowly building the fragile bond that had been missing for so long. Alice watched from a distance, her heart heavy with emotions she couldn't quite name. On the surface, things seemed to be improving, but beneath it all, a storm had been brewing. Alice had kept her own feelings about Walter locked away, carefully avoiding any direct confrontation with him. But the more she saw him and Molly together, the harder it became to suppress the flood of anger, betrayal, and unresolved pain that she had carried for years. She knew she couldn't avoid it any longer. There were too many unanswered questions, too much left unsaid between them. It was late one Saturday afternoon when Alice finally reached her breaking point. After watching Molly and Walter finish their visit at the park, she saw Walter walk toward her as Molly skipped ahead to the car. Alice's heart pounded, the tension building in her chest. This was the moment she had been dreading, but she couldn't keep avoiding it. Walter needed to know how she truly felt, and why she had kept him away for so long. Walter, Alice called, her voice sharp as she stepped away from the car, signaling for Molly to wait inside. Walter stopped, turning to face her with a mix of surprise and concern. He had sensed the tension between them growing, but hadn't pressed Alice for answers. "Alice, is something wrong?" he asked, his brows furrowing as he studied her face. She took a deep breath, feeling her emotions swell inside her like a tidal wave. "We need to talk," she said, her voice tight. Walter nodded slowly, sensing the seriousness in her tone. They moved a few steps away from the car, giving them some privacy, though Alice could still see Molly watching from the window. The last thing she wanted was for her daughter to overhear the conversation that was about to unfold. Alice crossed her arms, trying to steady herself as she looked at the man she had once loved, the man who had walked out of her life and left her to face everything alone. "You've been spending time with Molly, and I'm glad for her sake that things are going well," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "But we can't just pretend like none of this ever happened, Walter. We can't just pick up the pieces without addressing the mess you left behind." Walter sighed, his shoulders slumping. He had known this was coming. He had felt the weight of it in every conversation, every awkward glance Alice had given him since they reconnected. "I know," he said quietly, looking down at the ground. "I know I have a lot to answer for." Alice's eyes burned with unshed tears, but she forced herself to stay composed. She needed to get this out, needed to tell him what she had been holding inside for so long. "When you left," she said, her voice tightening with the weight of her pain, "you didn't just leave me. You didn't just walk away from our relationship. You abandoned your daughter. You abandoned the life we built, the promises we made. Do you have any idea what that did to me?" Walter flinched, the words cutting into him like knives. He looked up at Alice, his face etched with guilt and regret. "Alice, I never meant to hurt you like that," he said, his voice filled with sorrow. "I thought I was doing the right thing at the time. I thought if I disappeared, you and Molly would have a better chance, without me dragging you down." Alice's anger flared. "That's the problem, Walter. You decided for us. You made that decision without even talking to me. You left me to clean up the mess, to explain to our daughter why her father wasn't there. I had to be the one to make up stories, to shield her from the truth so she wouldn't grow up hating you." Walter's face paled, the full weight of his actions sinking in as Alice's words hung in the air. "I was ashamed," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I lost everything, Alice. The business, the money. I couldn't face you after that. I thought you'd be better off without me." Alice shook her head, her frustration boiling over. "You didn't lose everything, Walter. You still had us. But you chose to walk away instead of facing it. You left us when we needed you the most." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Do you know how hard it was for me to keep everything together? To raise Molly on my own, to make sure she never felt like she wasn't good enough because her father disappeared? I had to pretend like it didn't hurt when she asked about you. I had to lie to her for years, and now I'm the one dealing with the fallout." Walter's eyes glistened with tears of his own. He took a shaky breath, struggling to hold back the overwhelming guilt that threatened to consume him. "I never realized. I never thought about what it must have been like for you, Alice," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was so caught up in my own shame, my own failures, that I didn't think about the damage I was causing by leaving." Alice wiped her eyes, her anger slowly giving way to exhaustion. "I was angry, Walter. I still am. But I'm not the only one who suffered. Molly suffered too. She deserves better than this." Walter nodded, his face full of remorse. "You're right. She deserves better. And I know I can't fix the past, but I want to do everything I can to make things right now. I don't expect you to forgive me, Alice, but please, let me be there for Molly." Alice looked away, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She didn't know if she could ever fully forgive him for what he had done, but she couldn't deny that Molly deserved a chance to know her father, if that's what she wanted. After a long silence, Alice finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "I'm not doing this for you, Walter. I'm doing this for Molly. She wants to know you, and I won't stand in the way of that. But if you hurt her again, if you walk out of her life even once more, I won't give you another chance. Do you understand?" Walter's breath hitched, his heart aching with the weight of her ultimatum. He nodded, his voice filled with quiet determination. I understand. I swear, Alice, I won't let her down again. Alice studied him for a moment, searching his eyes for any hint of dishonesty. But all she saw was the broken man who had once been part of her life. The man who was trying, in his own flawed way, to make amends. Whether or not he could live up to his promises remained to be seen, but for Molly's sake, Alice was willing to give him that chance. I hope you mean that, she said softly, because this is your last one. Walter nodded again, his face solemn. I do. I won't fail her again. With that, the tension between them eased, if only slightly. It wasn't a reconciliation. Not yet. There were still too many wounds to heal, too much history to navigate. But it was a start, and for the first time in a long time, Alice felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. As they walked back toward the car, where Molly waited patiently, Alice glanced over at Walter. He was quiet, lost in thought, his expression pensive. There was still so much they needed to work through, but at least now, they were on the same page, for Molly's sake. As they reached the car, Molly looked up, her face lighting up with a smile. Mommy, can we go get ice cream? She asked eagerly, her eyes bright with excitement. Alice smiled, the tension of the confrontation beginning to fade. Sure, sweetie. Let's go get some ice cream. Walter glanced at Alice, a small, grateful smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. For the first time in years, it felt like they were moving forward, not just for themselves, but for the one person who mattered most, Molly. The following days passed in a blur for Alice. Every night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Walter's return and what it meant for Molly and for her. The conversation they'd had in the park echoed in her mind. She had made it clear that this was Walter's last chance, but the lingering question of whether he could truly change gnawed at her. Would he really be there for Molly this time? Or was she setting her daughter up for heartbreak? Molly, on the other hand, seemed more at peace than Alice had expected. She asked about Walter often, curious about the man she was still getting to know. Sometimes she would sit with Alice at the dinner table, peppering her with questions about when she was little, what her parents were like, and why they hadn't been together. Every question made Alice's heart ache a little more, but she tried her best to answer honestly, without letting her own pain cloud Molly's growing curiosity. But the real turning point came one evening, when Molly came to Alice with a question that shook her to the core. Mommy, Molly asked, standing at the doorway to the kitchen as Alice washed the dishes. Her voice was soft, hesitant, the way she always sounded when she was about to ask something big. Alice turned, wiping her hands on a towel. What is it, sweetheart? Molly bit her lip, her fingers twisting nervously in front of her. Do you think maybe I could spend more time with Walter? Like, at his house or something? Alice froze, the dish in her hand slipping from her grasp and clattering into the sink. The air seemed to still around her, the weight of Molly's words hanging in the space between them. She had anticipated this moment eventually, but not so soon. Her mind raced as she searched for a response, but the initial shock left her speechless. Sweetie, what do you mean? Alice asked carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. You want to go to Walter's place? Molly nodded slowly. Yeah. He said maybe I could come over sometime, but I wanted to ask you first. Alice's heart pounded in her chest. She set the towel down, turning fully to face Molly, her thoughts swirling. She knew Walter didn't have much. He was staying in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, trying to piece his life back together. It wasn't exactly a stable home, and the thought of sending Molly there filled her with dread. But the way Molly looked up at her, her big eyes full of hope, made Alice pause. How could she crush her daughter's excitement without hurting her? Molly, Alice began slowly, crouching down so she was eye level with her. I know you're curious about your dad, and I'm glad you're getting to know him. But things are still a little complicated. Walter is trying to get his life back together, and I want to make sure everything is stable before you spend more time with him outside of our visits. Do you understand? Molly's face fell slightly, her small shoulders slumping. So, I can't go? She asked, her voice filled with disappointment. Alice felt her heart break a little at the sight. She hated being the one to say no, the one to put boundaries in place, but she couldn't risk exposing Molly to the instability that still lingered in Walter's life. "I'm not saying no," Alice said gently, placing a hand on Molly's arm. "I just want to make sure everything is safe and ready. Maybe one day, but not yet. Okay?" Molly looked down at her feet, clearly disappointed, but she nodded slowly. "Okay," she whispered. Alice pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly. "I know it's hard, sweetie, but I promise, I'm only doing this because I want what's best for you." Molly hugged her back, but Alice could feel the tension in her small body. She knew this wasn't the answer Molly had hoped for, and it pained her to see the spark of excitement dim in her daughter's eyes. Later that night, as Alice sat on the edge of her bed, her phone buzzed with a message from Walter. "Hey, Molly told me she asked about coming over. I hope I didn't overstep by mentioning it to her. Just wanted to check in." Alice stared at the message for a long moment, her fingers hovering over the screen. She appreciated that Walter was reaching out, but the situation was becoming more complicated by the day. She had already made it clear that this was his last chance, and now she was faced with the reality of balancing Molly's curiosity and the need to protect her from potential disappointment. With a deep sigh, she typed a response. She did ask. "I told her not yet. I need to know that things are more stable on your end before we talk about her spending time with you at your place." Walter's reply came quickly, as if he had been waiting for her message. "I understand. I'm working on it. I want to do this right, Alice. I want to be there for her, but I get that you need to feel comfortable with that too." Alice's fingers trembled slightly as she typed her response. "I appreciate that, Walter. I really do. But this isn't just about you being around now. It's about being consistent. Molly is excited to know you, but I need to know that you're ready for the long haul. No more disappearing." This time, Walter's reply took a little longer to come through. "I promise, Alice. I won't disappear again. I'll do whatever it takes to prove that to you and to her." Alice leaned back against her pillows, staring at the ceiling. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that Walter had truly changed, that he was ready to be the father Molly deserved. But the scars of the past ran deep, and the fear of letting him back in, only for him to disappear again, was something Alice couldn't shake. The next weekend, Walter brought up the topic again during their regular visit at the park. Molly was running ahead, chasing a squirrel near the playground, while Alice and Walter sat on a bench, watching her with shared smiles. "I know you're hesitant," Walter began, his tone gentle but serious. "But I'm getting my feet back under me, Alice. I've been looking at more stable work, trying to save up for a better place. I want to do this the right way." Alice glanced at him, her stomach twisting with anxiety. "It's not just about a better place, Walter. You've been out of her life for years. You can't just expect her to dive into this without me being cautious." Walter nodded, his expression earnest. "I get that. I do. I just want you to know that I'm not running this time. I'm here for the long haul." Alice bit her lip, unsure of what to say. She didn't want to shut him out. After all, Molly needed her father. But the fear of opening that door again, of letting Walter back into their lives only for him to leave once more, weighed heavily on her heart. Walter seemed to sense her hesitation. "Look, I'll follow your lead, Alice," he said quietly. "I know I've got a lot to prove, and I'll do whatever it takes to show you that I'm not going anywhere." Alice stared out at Molly, who was laughing as she played, her joy so pure and uninhibited. She wanted to protect that happiness, to shield her daughter from any more hurt. But she also knew that Molly deserved to know her father, to have a chance at building something real with him. With a deep breath, Alice made a decision, one that felt terrifying but necessary. "Let's take it slow," she said finally, turning to face Walter. "I'm not ready to let her stay over yet, but we can start spending more time together. Maybe we can do something outside the park next weekend. Just the three of us." Walter's face lit up with hope, his eyes shining with gratitude. "I'd like that," he said softly. "Thank you, Alice." Alice nodded, though her heart still felt heavy with uncertainty. There were no guarantees that things would go smoothly, no promise that Walter wouldn't falter again. But for Molly's sake, she was willing to try. As they watched Molly chase the squirrel around the playground, Alice felt the weight of her decision settle over her. The road ahead was uncertain, and the risks were high. But maybe, just maybe, it was a step toward healing the fractures of their broken family. Only time would tell. The next weekend came quickly, and with it, an unfamiliar mix of excitement and anxiety. For the first time in years, Alice, Walter, and Molly were going to spend the day together, outside of Central Park. It was a simple plan: lunch at a nearby diner, and then a visit to the city zoo. Molly had been ecstatic when Alice told her, jumping up and down with the kind of joy only a child could express. But for Alice, the decision was far more complicated. She had agreed to let Walter take a bigger role in Molly's life, but her heart was still weighed down by years of pain, betrayal, and fear. She had to see if Walter could really follow through on his promises, if he was truly committed to rebuilding what he had broken. The morning was gray, the sky blanketed with heavy clouds, but the air was warm and humid as they walked to the diner together. Molly skipped ahead, her hair bouncing in the slight breeze, and Alice watched her daughter with a mix of pride and protectiveness. She stole a glance at Walter, who walked beside her, his hands in his pockets, his eyes tracking every step Molly took. He looked different now, less haggard, more present, but the years of absence still showed in the lines etched across his face. Walter caught Alice's glance, and their eyes met for a brief moment. He offered a small, hesitant smile. Alice forced herself to smile back, though it felt stiff, like wearing a mask. There was still a canyon between them, filled with years of silence, unspoken apologies, and too much hurt. As much as Alice wanted to believe in the possibility of healing, the fear of being let down again clung to her like a shadow. They arrived at the diner, a cozy, family-owned spot nestled on a busy street corner. The smell of frying bacon and coffee filled the air as they stepped inside. Molly rushed ahead to pick a booth by the window, her face pressed against the glass as she watched the bustling city outside. "Can I sit by the window, Mommy?" Molly asked, turning to Alice with wide, eager eyes. Alice smiled softly. "Of course, sweetheart." They slid into the booth, Molly by the window, Alice across from her, and Walter next to Molly. The waitress appeared moments later, a woman in her late 50s with a warm smile and notepad in hand. "What can I get for you folks today?" she asked, her pen poised above the paper. Molly spoke first, her eyes still glued to the menu. "Pancakes, please, with extra syrup." The waitress chuckled. "Good choice, sweetheart. And for you too?" Alice ordered a simple salad, barely looking at the menu. Her stomach was too knotted with nerves to consider anything heavier. Walter ordered a sandwich, his voice steady but soft, like he was treading carefully in this fragile moment. As they waited for their food, the atmosphere felt thick with unspoken words. Alice sipped her water, watching as Molly animatedly talked about her favorite animals, listing all the ones she hoped to see at the zoo. Walter nodded along, smiling at her enthusiasm, but there was a quiet tension between him and Alice that neither of them could ignore. After a few minutes, Walter turned to Alice, his voice low. "I just wanted to say thank you for letting us do this today. I know it's not easy for you." Alice met his gaze, the sincerity in his eyes catching her off guard. She hadn't expected him to acknowledge how difficult this was. For a brief moment, the walls she had built around her heart wavered. "I'm doing this for Molly," she said, her voice cool but not unkind. "She deserves to have her father in her life." Walter nodded, his expression softening with understanding. "I know, and I want to be that for her. I just want you to know that I'm serious about this, Alice. About being here for her. For both of you." Alice felt a pang in her chest. "For both of you." The words hung in the air, laden with a meaning she wasn't sure she was ready to face. She looked down at the table, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of her glass. It was too soon, too fragile a moment to dive into that conversation. Before she could respond, the waitress returned with their food. Molly's pancakes were piled high with syrup, and she squealed in delight, immediately digging in. The lightness of the moment cut through the tension, if only for a little while. As they ate, Molly kept the conversation flowing, talking excitedly about her favorite cartoon characters, her best friends from school, and how she was definitely going to feed the giraffes at the zoo later. Alice and Walter listened, exchanging occasional glances, But for the most part, it was Molly's laughter that filled the silence between them. Alice was grateful for it, grateful for Molly's ability to make everything seem simpler, even when it wasn't. After breakfast, they made their way to the zoo. As soon as they entered, Molly ran ahead, her energy seemingly endless as she darted from one exhibit to the next. Alice and Walter followed closely behind, staying near but letting Molly lead the way. The zoo was crowded with families, children laughing and tugging their parents from one animal enclosure to another. They reached the giraffe exhibit, and true to her word, Molly insisted on feeding them. Alice smiled as she watched her daughter hold out a handful of leaves to the tall, gentle creatures. Her laughter rang out, pure and joyful, as the giraffe's long tongue reached out to grab the food from her tiny hand. "Look, Daddy," Molly called out to Walter, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "They're so big." Walter's face lit up at the sound of Molly calling him Daddy. It was the first time she had done so, and Alice noticed the way it softened him. He stepped closer, kneeling beside Molly, who beamed as she fed another giraffe. "Yeah, they are big," Walter said, his voice filled with awe, not just at the animals, but at the moment itself. He glanced up at Alice, his eyes full of gratitude. For a second, the bitterness and anger between them melted away, replaced by something else, something neither of them was ready to name. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of laughter and sunshine. They wandered through the zoo, watching the lions stretch lazily in the sun, the penguins wobble across the icy rocks, and the monkeys swing playfully from tree to tree. Molly was in her element, her excitement contagious as she dragged them from one exhibit to the next. But even as they laughed and enjoyed the day, Alice's mind was far from at ease. Each smile, each moment of joy, was tinged with an underlying tension. She kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for something to shatter this fragile peace they had found. When the day finally came to an end, they walked back to the car, Molly skipping happily ahead, chattering about her favorite animals. Alice and Walter followed behind, the sun setting on the horizon, casting a warm glow over the city. Walter stopped for a moment, his hand gently touching Alice's arm to get her attention. She turned to him, her heart pounding with uncertainty. His face was serious, but there was a softness in his expression that made her pause. "Alice," he began, his voice low, "I know I've said this before, but I'm really trying. I'm trying to make up for all the time I lost, for everything I did wrong." Alice swallowed hard, her throat tight. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that he meant every word. But the years of abandonment had left scars, scars that didn't heal easily. "I know," she said quietly, looking down at her feet, "and I want to believe you, Walter. But it's hard. I can't just forget everything that happened." "I don't expect you to forget," Walter said softly, "but I'm hoping we can at least start to move forward. For Molly's sake, and maybe for ours too." Alice looked up at him, her chest tightening with emotion. There was a part of her that wanted to forgive him, to let go of the anger and hurt she had been carrying for so long. But forgiveness wasn't something that came easily, especially not after years of pain. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Alice whispered, her voice barely audible. Walter nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "I know, but I'm not going anywhere this time, Alice. I'll keep showing up, for as long as it takes." Alice's heart ached with the weight of his words. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let go. But for now, all she could do was nod and take one step forward, just as she had done that morning. As they reached the car, Molly turned to them, her face beaming with happiness. "Can we come back next weekend?" she asked eagerly. Alice glanced at Walter, who looked at her with a quiet, hopeful smile. She nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Yeah, Molly, I think we can." A month had passed since that day at the zoo, and things were beginning to change in ways Alice hadn't anticipated. Each week, Walter continued to show up, on time, consistent, and dedicated. He joined Molly and Alice for family outings, helped with homework, and even began attending Molly's soccer games on Saturdays. Slowly but surely, a fragile but growing rhythm settled between them, like pieces of a puzzle finally starting to fit into place. But despite these improvements, Alice remained cautious. Each time she saw Molly laugh with her father, or the two of them bond over something as simple as an inside joke, a small voice whispered in her mind, reminding her of how easily things could fall apart. It was hard to shake the fear that this was temporary, that Walter's reappearance in their lives might not last. One evening, Alice stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup while Molly sat at the kitchen table, drawing a picture for school. Walter was coming over for dinner, something that had become a regular occurrence. As the smell of the simmering soup filled the house, Alice found herself lost in thought, stirring absent-mindedly as memories from years ago flooded her mind. Memories of when she and Walter had once shared a life, before everything had unraveled. She didn't hear the door open until Molly jumped up excitedly. "Daddy's here," she squealed, running to the front door. Alice's heart skipped a beat as she heard Walter's familiar voice greeting Molly. She set the spoon down and wiped her hands, stepping into the hallway just as Walter scooped Molly up in his arms, laughing as she clung to him. "Hey there, kiddo," Walter said, his face lighting up with a smile. He looked up and saw Alice standing in the doorway, and his expression softened. "Hey, Alice." "Hey," she replied, forcing a smile, though her chest felt tight. The sight of Walter holding Molly, being a part of their daily routine, still felt strange, even after weeks of him being back in their lives. "Dinner's almost ready," Alice added, her voice a little more distant than she intended. She turned and headed back to the kitchen, feeling the weight of the past pressing against the present. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't seem to fully reconcile the man standing in her hallway now with the one who had walked out years ago. Walter followed her into the kitchen, setting Molly down so she could return to her drawing. He watched Alice for a moment, sensing her tension. "I can help with something if you want," he offered quietly. Alice shook her head, focusing on ladling the soup into bowls. "No, I've got it," she said, her tone polite but distant. She felt him watching her, waiting for her to say more, but she wasn't ready to open up. Not yet. They ate dinner together in the small dining room, the conversation mostly driven by Molly's excited recounting of her day at school. She filled the silence with stories about her friends, her teacher, and the art project she was working on. Alice listened, smiling at her daughter's enthusiasm, but her mind was elsewhere. After dinner, while Molly was getting ready for bed, Walter lingered in the living room. Alice stood in the kitchen, cleaning up the dishes, her thoughts racing as she tried to sort through the complicated feelings swirling inside her. She didn't hear Walter approach until he spoke softly from the doorway. "Alice," he began, his voice gentle, "can we talk?" She paused, gripping the dish towel in her hand, knowing this conversation had been coming for a while. With a sigh, she turned to face him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of hesitation. But Walter looked at her with quiet determination, his expression serious but open. "What do you want to talk about?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Walter stepped closer, his hands resting at his sides. "I know things have been complicated," he said slowly. "I know I've put you through a lot, and I know it's not easy for you to trust me again, but I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere." "Not this time." Alice felt her heart clench. She had heard these words before, promises made in the past, before everything had fallen apart. But there was something different in his voice now, something steadier, more grounded. "Walter, it's not just about you being here now," she said, her voice wavering. "You've shown up these past few weeks, and I'm grateful for that. But it's hard for me to forget what happened. You left us. You left me. And I can't just pretend that doesn't matter." Walter's face tightened with regret. He took a deep breath, nodding slowly. "I know," he whispered. "I think about that every day, Alice. I think about the years I lost with you and Molly, and I'll never stop regretting that. But I'm here now because I want to make it right." Alice looked away, her emotions bubbling dangerously close to the surface. She had held everything in for so long. Her anger, her heartbreak, her fear of being vulnerable again. But as Walter stood there, his eyes filled with remorse and sincerity, something inside her began to crack. "I was angry for so long," Alice admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had to be strong for Molly, and I convinced myself that I didn't need you anymore. But the truth is, it hurt, Walter. It hurt more than I ever let myself admit. Walter stepped closer, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. I know, Alice, and I'm so sorry. I wish I could take it all back, but I can't. All I can do is be here now, and hope that maybe one day you'll be able to forgive me. Alice's throat tightened as tears welled in her eyes. She had spent so many years building walls around her heart, protecting herself from the pain of his absence. But now, standing there in the kitchen with him, those walls were beginning to crumble. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said, her voice trembling. Not yet, but I can see that you're trying. And for Molly's sake, I want to believe that you've changed. Walter nodded, his eyes filled with quiet determination. I have, Alice. I'm not the same person I was back then. I know I don't deserve your trust, but I'm going to earn it, no matter how long it takes. Alice looked at him for a long moment, her heart torn between the fear of being hurt again and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, Walter could truly be the father and partner she had once believed he could be. I'm not making any promises, she said softly, but I'm willing to try. For Molly. And for us. Walter's face softened, relief washing over him as he nodded. That's all I'm asking for. Just then, Molly appeared in the hallway, her pajamas on and her hair slightly damp from her bath. Mommy, can Daddy tuck me in tonight? She asked, her voice filled with innocent excitement. Alice glanced at Walter, who smiled warmly at their daughter. Of course, kiddo, he said gently, walking over to her and scooping her up into his arms. As they disappeared down the hallway, Alice stood alone in the kitchen, her heart heavy but hopeful. She knew there was still a long road ahead, filled with uncertainty and the possibility of more pain. But for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. Maybe this time, Walter would stay. Maybe, after all the hurt and heartbreak, there was still a chance for them to be a family again. As Alice turned off the lights and headed toward Molly's room to join them, she realized something important. Forgiveness wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about moving forward, together. And maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to do that. For the first time in a long time, Alice felt like they might have a future worth believing in. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story about overcoming challenges and family love, don't forget to like the video, comment on what touched you the most, and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for our next exciting story.